So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a brand new tool that we've launched in MyGeotab. I'll show you how to access it. It's called the Vehicle Data Access Tool, and it is completely available as of this week. So what we're going to talk about in this session here is we believe that the next big thing you need to know about your fleet is vehicle data access. Because that's changing on a week-by-week basis, on a month-by-month basis. And we're going to talk about why is vehicle data access really essential to what we need to do. And that may be obvious to some, but I'm going to throw out a few different use cases and examples there. How does this tool that we've built actually work? What is the data telling us about access to our fleet vehicles? And then most importantly, where are we going from here? This is only a version 1.0. And we see it being a multi-stakeholder engagement. So it's starting off as a Geotab engagement, but we want to involve multiple OEMs and multiple stakeholders across the board, because we realize that the data that we have, although it's up to 2 million vehicles right now, there's so much more that we can do beyond that. Data has been coined as oil, right? It's the new oil that allows us to do so many different things. But we really believe it's oxygen for a fleet, right? You can't even live without this data sometimes to be able to make the necessary improvements within your infrastructure. So we believe that data is truly oxygen. And the OBD device has been established as that kind of device of choice for fleets. It allows us to make that data link and grab some really rich data, everything from windshield wiper activation through to engine RPM, you name it, is all coming through this port. And one of the things that is so critical about data access is that we must find a way to do it across the board. We have mixed fleets for all of our commercial customers, and whether I'm dealing with a Toyota, whether I'm dealing with a GM, whether I'm dealing with a Ford, how do I make sure that that is stable and the quality of data is good across the board? Data is the input for innovation as well, too. Without data, we can't create these amazing artificial intelligence and machine learning models. We can't do anything without the actual data. But the funny thing about data is sometimes you don't know what you don't know until you have access to it. So that's why access is so important. As an example, a few years back, we did a quick little blog on an earthquake that hit Mexico City. And who would have thought that Geotab devices driving in and around Mexico could have acted as a bit of an indicator for this earthquake. So when we looked at it, it wasn't the z-axis deflection the magnitude of that actually indicated the earthquake, was the volume of vehicles in and around that same area that woke up at the exact same time. So not necessarily saying that we're earthquake predictors, but imagine having a few of those vehicles down the southern tip of South America and adding that to earthquake detection mechanisms that exist already. Those few seconds delay from the time the earthquake hits in the bottom of South America to the time it hits California can make a huge difference. So you don't know what you don't know with data sometimes, so you need access to this data to empower innovation. So that's why there's so much concern from the mobility community around closing the OBD port and what that actually does mean to data access and to innovation. So OBD data has been trusted for a long period of time. It's been used by many of the world's largest commercial fleets for years and years. It's been adopted by the federal government, municipal governments, state-level governments, very, very trusted data. And even more so now, as we've seen, Neil gave a little bit of a talk about this. We'll be talking more about this later on as well, too. Being used by public policymakers as well. Smart city innovation is being powered by a lot of this data, right? So everything from congestion management to air quality, you name it, dangerous driving areas in cities, all of this data requires access from the vehicles in a standardized way. Not only to mention that, but it's being relied upon in civil and criminal court proceedings for collision reconstruction as well. But it goes beyond that. It goes beyond commercial fleet customers. It goes to the point of, how can this data be used for public good, right? Everything from looking at electric vehicle suitability assessments. If I don't have access to that data, how am I going to be able to tell within a fleet, which vehicles I should be swapping out for EVs? Imagine being able to pump through ABS activation in different roadways within a municipality to be able to detect black ice areas. All of this is for public good and public consumption. So it's not only about data access for the fleet and the commercial use cases, it's for public good as well too. So the need to keep this data open and accessible is crucially important. As Peter Drucker once coined, and we believe in this as well too, you cannot manage what you can't measure, right? You just simply cannot do that. If you don't have access to this data, you can't manage anything. And we have to replace these anecdotes. So is speeding, attributable to dangerous driving? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But if I don't have the data, I can't tell. We did a few studies where they thought speeding in general was important, but it ended up for this customer, speeding just within the city areas was a bigger risk indicator from a safety perspective. And we'll be talking a little bit more about safety and how we applied some artificial intelligence for that in a few sessions later. It helps advance our essential goals towards cybersecurity, sustainability, innovation, really important. And what we're looking to do here, this, like I mentioned, is a version 1.0 of this accessibility index. We want to make it a multi-stakeholder engagement. So if you're dealing with an OBD port device or if you're dealing with access directly from an API from one of the OEMs, it doesn't matter. It's about vehicle data access. So our engagements in the future will be looking at pulling in data from the OEMs and looking at how am I making sure that all of the vehicles are as accessible as possible and looking at that index. So let's talk about version 1.0 of this index. So right now we've got 2 million vehicles. That counter just flipped earlier on this week. But of those 2 million vehicles, there's only about 1 million or so that we're using in this index. And that's for a number of reasons. Because there has to be enough from a statistical significance perspective for us to be able to give you a good measure. So for certain makes and models of vehicles, we may not have sufficient of them to be able to even give you a good idea of where it stands from an accessibility perspective. So that's why we're at just over 1 million. It's across 18 OEMs, 32 makes of vehicles, and 387 models. And what we've done is we've focused, again, there is a bias to this data because it is focused on commercial fleets. So I just want to make sure everybody is clear that it's only commercial fleets we're talking about here. And we started off with some basic parameters: access to VIN, access to odo, access to fuel, access to seatbelt. We're going to go beyond that, but we felt that these were the 4 kind of basic parameters that we needed to look at from an accessibility perspective. We'll go beyond that and look at roadworthiness scores, things like check engine oil light, ABS activation, that kind of thing. And again, just to be clear, this is all from the OBD device for version 1.0. So if we're looking at an OEM distribution perspective, we have OEMs from across various regions. So 35% of the OEMs come from the Americas, 35% from Europe, and 30% from Asia. So what we're looking at is, I'll highlight the methodology very, very quickly here, then we'll dive into each one of these areas to give you an idea of how we run this score and then how you access it within MyGeotab. So the first step is we're going to identify the manufacturer, make sure we've got that. Second step, we generate all the vehicle data that we use to create this score that we've coined. We apply exclusions. As I mentioned, we brought it down from 2 million vehicles down to 1 million vehicles. Well, there was a reason for that, and we'll talk about some of the exclusion criteria that we put in there. And then we'll show you how we calculate the index, and that's done in a few different ways. And then we manage for privacy as well, too. So we just got to make sure that no matter what we're doing here, we're managing for privacy, and we're not including any identifiable data from any customers. So the first thing we do is we look at identifying the manufacturer. So to do that, we look at our VIN decoder, which is based off of NHTSA, and we're able to actually identify the manufacturer from about 98% of the cases. The other 2%, we can't identify manufacturer directly from the VIN, so we have a look at the WMI code within the VIN, and for about 0.6% of those, we're able to get the manufacturer, and the other 1.4%, unfortunately, we can't and we don't use within the index. So again, first point, identify the manufacturer. Second thing we do is we generate all this vehicle data. So we need to be able to determine the accessibility of a vehicle based on region. So in order to do that, we need to understand where is the vehicle domiciled. So we look at a lot of trip and location data that tells us, was the vehicle driving in North America predominantly? Is it Latin America? Are we talking about European vehicles? And then what does the activity look like over the last 12 months? If we don't have sufficient driving behavior, then we can't even include them as part of this index. Then, of course, we look at support for odometer, for fuel, for seatbelt, and then, is the VIN complete? Is it valid? And these are all the things that we look at as features that go into creating this index. Then we look at applying our exclusion criteria. So there's some catch-all exclusions that we've created here. So if the vehicle is newer, those are the only ones we're looking at, 10 years and younger, okay? There has to be sufficient activity as well. So if they haven't driven more than 10 kilometers in a month or more than 30 minutes, we're not taking those vehicles into account. And we have a number of third-party devices pushing data into the Geotab ecosystem as well, too. So if we're not collecting engine data, then we're excluding those as well. We also look at a trend, right? So what we're mapping as well, too, is not only the current index of that make and model and OEM, but we're looking at what the trend looks like over time. So we need to have over 100 vehicles in each year for the OEM to be able to plot this trend out. And we have to have over 3 years for that OEM in the database to have something statistically significant. And then consistency, we're not only looking at OEM, but by very individual model as well, too, of vehicles. So if we don't have over 100 vehicles for every model, again, it gets completely excluded from the score. And we need to have at least 3 models for a specific OEM to be able to calculate this score. The next thing we do is we look at that trend, right? So that trend looks at over the period of a maximum 10 years, right? We look at, are we on an upward trend? We look at the percentage support across the OEM for every single individual year, and then we plot that, and we look for a trend. Is it a neutral trend? Are they not improving or in consistency? Are they improving consistently, or is there a decrease? So it's quite simple correlation. So neutral, upward, or downward. And then what's, I think, the most interesting is this consistency score. And I'll explain how that kind of works. So there's this notion of, OK, well, if I've got Volkswagen and I've got, maybe 100,000 Volkswagens within the Geotab ecosystem, well, maybe 97% of them are fully accessible according to those 4 features. But maybe different makes and models, different models have different consistency scores. So what we're looking at is how consistent is that OEM across all the models. So when you make that decision about which vehicles you're looking to purchase within your own ecosystems, you can see by model how the consistency varies for that specific OEM. One thing that is important to note is that there's a little bit of bias there right now, and we're going to try and correct for some of that bias. But the bias comes from the fact that if I've only got 3 models for a specific OEM and another OEM has 100 different models, odds are of having a higher consistency score for the lower number of models within an OEM. So those are some things that we're going to look at correcting for in the future. Some other features that we're going to add: consistency across different regions. How does that vary across different trims of the same model? So that goes into the consistency score. So here's a couple of different examples. Here's an example of a high consistency score. So in this case here, Volkswagen had 97% accessibility across those 4 parameters. So fuel, odo, seatbelt, and VIN. So 97% of all Volkswagens in the Geotab ecosystem, let's be clear, we are talking about the Geotab ecosystem, have full access. But that score of 0.92 means that, OK, well, across most models, we're actually doing pretty good, right? It's not a low score. So I'm going to show you a couple of other different examples. So let's have a look at Toyota. So Toyota fares kind of medium on that consistency score. So if you look at the overall percent, so of all Toyotas, again, for those 4 parameters, 78% of them have full access to all of those parameters. But they score lower on the consistency trend. And why is that? Well, due mostly to the Corolla and the Tacoma there, who don't have full access across all of those 4 parameters. So that brings down the consistency score for Toyota. Another example of a lower consistency score would be for Volvo. Volvo in general has a great score across all vehicles. We are very heavily weighted on the trucking side, and for trucks they have excellent scores. But as you look at the distribution and the other models of passenger vehicles, the scores aren't quite as good across all 4 of those parameters. So that brings down the consistency level as well. So again, very clear that this is based on Geotab data. So how do you access this tool? So everybody who has MyGeotab has full access to this tool to be able to pull it off at any point in time. We put it under the Fleet Industry Trends report. So if you go into MyGeotab in Fleet Industry Trends, you'll have access to it there. And it kind of looks like this. So you pop in the make and model of vehicle that you want to have a look at. In this case, it's a Chevy Silverado. And you can see by region the support for each one of those 4 parameters, and then the full level support as well, too. If it's not available in that region, then we simply don't show it. And you kind of see a matrix-based approach here. I'm not sure if the lines are really showing up, but there's kind of a cross-haired lines there. And in this case, for Chevy, the x-axis, that indicates, well, how good is the full support for all Chevys? And then the consistency score is on the Y scale. So it does well in general, but across makes and models for Chevrolet, the consistency isn't all that great. In general, you know what? We're doing pretty good. Over of the 1 million vehicles considered, 94.3% have access to these basic parameters, and the average consistency score across everything is 0.66. So not bad in general. I thought I'd show just a quick little animation of it in action there. So you type in your model vehicle that you're looking at. If you hover over, you can kind of see the parameters for full support in different regions. And what's important to note, too, that dot there indicates the upward, downward, or neutral trend for the OEM. So while you're looking at the individual model up top, when you go down below, it shows the associated OEM and whether it's on an upward, downward, or neutral trend. So most manufacturers have really good access across the board. So you can kind of see here some of the more accessible models, some of the lesser accessible models. Again, a good news story across the board. A few model highlights. So 328 models have more than 80% of their vehicles with this full data access. And 58 models have less than 80% with full data access. You can kind of get a sense of the more fleet-friendly and lesser fleet-friendly vehicles in the equation. In general, I thought it was interesting to look at the trends as well, too. So 25% of the OEMs were on an upward trend, 34% on a downward, and about 41% neutral as an overall. So what are some of the next steps for us? Where are we going from here with this index? So we believe in this continuous review and feedback cycle within this accessibility index. We're going to continue internal development on what we're doing, including new features like roadworthiness into the index and looking at more data that we can pull in. We're going to continue with our internal review of this. So we have an internal review panel consisting of folks from the data teams, the embedded teams, and our product safety teams that will continue this rigorous internal review. And we have an external review panel that we've engaged with industry experts that have been phenomenal in providing feedback even into this first iteration. As a second phase, so that's a kind of phase 1 and phase 2, we're already complete. We've done an external technical review with folks outside of the Geotab ecosystem. What we're doing right now is we're inviting associations, fleets, and most importantly, the OEMs to the table because we want to make sure that this isn't OBD-centric. We see it going, again, it's a multi-stakeholder engagement that isn't just Geotab, and it should be positioned as access to vehicle data, period. Whether that comes from an API, the OBD port, it doesn't matter. That's where we're interested in taking this. This is a first step. It's a 1.0 tool that exists as Geotab only right now. So if you're interested in becoming involved, I've left my email address up there. Send me an email, and we'll coordinate things, and we'll make sure that we do engage with you. Access to vehicle data it is like oxygen. It's so important for innovation in this world. So we need to make sure that we collectively do what we can to ensure that it does remain open, available, and accessible. So with that, I'm finished the presentation here, and I guess we've got, and I don't know if we have any questions from the live feed.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Mike. So again, a quick reminder here, the game code is 7707. We haven't seen any questions come in on the live Q&A, so we'll open up to the audience in case they have any questions.
Bob. We haven't talked about that yet, but happy to maybe discuss with you a little bit because there could be a potential.
We're being asked to move to FMS.
Okay.
And my concern is that I want to make sure that we don't lose access to any data that we currently have.
Yeah.
We can through OBD.
Okay. Yeah, let's. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Yeah, Nelson.
I'm so worried about the not-friendly vehicles that provide that.
Mm-hmm.
Because in our countries we are using a lot of that kind of vehicles.
Yep.
Something are doing Geotab, or maybe the dealers have to do something with the OEMs or the manufacturers to change that? What happened in the near future, maybe with rules or because we need the data. I don't know why not that vehicles provide the data.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is challenging across the board by make and model of vehicle. What this tool hopefully helps us do is have an engagement with the OEMs as well too, and to be able to understand, okay, well, which are lesser accessible. We do see areas in Latin America and everything where it is lesser accessible. This is meant to be an engagement tool that opens that dialogue so we can see broadly, well, what is going on? Is there a problem here? You know, can we at Geotab help in any manner possible? So yeah, I know that there are issues specifically in different areas of the world, but this is meant as a tool to highlight that, and let's see how we can impact and change from multi-stakeholder engagement. Yeah.
So are we using the feedback that we're getting, you know, to partner with
Yeah.
this question is, are we using the feedback that we're getting when we find that, for instance, seatbelt, all right, it's disappeared. Well, it didn't disappear. It's just we're not asking for it in the appropriate manner. So are we reverse engineering back into it so that we can actually get that seatbelt data back up? Are we partnering, as Geotab, are we partnering with the OEM to say, hey, can you just re-expose, you know, tell me, you know, what the ask is to re-expose seatbelt for this model year?
I think that's a fantastic addition to this. So as we go from version 1.0, we wanted to make sure we got something out there that has some meat on the bones. But I think that's an excellent suggestion for a version 2 where we can look at, okay, well, what has dropped off, right? Because we actually saw for like the Tacoma and the Corolla that it did drop off and come.
Yeah. It's still there.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's still there.
Okay.
It's just we're not asking for it in
Yeah.
the appropriate manner. They
Yeah.
change the way you get to it.
Yes.
Yeah, we need to partner back up with them and say, hey, can you...
And all the more need for this round table of engagement, and that's really what this is positioned to do. And we have had a number of OEMs who have expressed interest, and we're going to be working with them in this multi-stakeholder engagement because we just believe it's so crucial. When things get changed, we need to be aware of that. And again, it's not just about the OBD; it's about API access, cloud-to-cloud integration. So it's not an OBD-centric thing. But yeah, I think having that multi-stakeholder engagement is the only way we can do this.
And then for the Latin America side of it, we did our installations down there. We realized that when the vehicles were spec'd, they were not spec'd with CAN connectivity, although it was available. It was an extra cost option, and it just saving money, right? So are we putting together recommendations for our customers when they do procure order vehicles to make sure that that is included? Without the connector,
Would you like to join the consortium? Happy to have you on board. Yeah. No, excellent points. Anybody else? Any questions? Yes?
How do you anticipate that OEM embedded devices are going to impact data accessibility?
Oh, they'll have it. So they'll impact it in a way that I'm not certain of at this point in time. But that's why we want to go through that exploratory phase. And it's not just having access to, well, we are exposing these specific parameters. So, well, let's collectively test that. What does that look like, right? Because it will have an impact on that. This is just OBD devices. And we want to see what that impact is, right? We want to make sure that as we're looking at working with Ford, GM, and beyond, what does API access look like? What are the, and we need to have a sufficient number of vehicles as a test sample to be able to look at that as well too. Access to 1 or 2 isn't going to do it, right? But again, all the more need for this consortium so we can look at elevating what we're all doing from a data accessibility perspective. But we'll definitely have an impact here. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody, and please check it out in MyGeotab.